When I use the phrase generational wounds, I'm not talking about trauma in the clinical sense. I'm talking about why you are the way you are, and why it's not your fault. Generational wounds are the psychological patterns a whole generation developed in response to the world it grew up in. They are not signs of weakness or dysfunction. They are adaptations, shaped by instability, changing family structures, economic uncertainty, and constant pressure to stay functional. If you carry chronic tension, a deep sense of responsibility, difficulty resting without guilt, or an instinct to stay alert even when life is calm, this didn't appear randomly, and it didn't start with you. This video is about how your generation shaped the way your nervous system learned to operate, and why those patterns once made sense. More importantly, it's about what becomes possible when you understand that context instead of blaming yourself for it. This is not about blaming your parents, and it's not about excusing yourself from responsibility. It's about clarity. Because once you understand why these patterns formed, you can finally decide which of them still serve you and which ones no longer need to run your life. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Survival. Imagine someone sitting at their kitchen table at 2 in the morning, completely unable to sleep because they are mentally running through every single item on tomorrow's schedule. This experience is not a sign that they are broken or fundamentally flawed, even if it feels that way in the silence of the night. When there is a persistent pull in the chest and a quiet, constant sense of responsibility for making sure everything is okay, it should never be seen as a character flaw. Instead, we must understand this behavior through the lens of context and life history, which explains why the mind refuses to simply power down and rest. To understand this more clearly, we should look at the story of a young woman named Stevie from a Netflix film called In Your Dreams. When her parents' marriage began falling apart, Stevie did exactly what many children do in the face of such overwhelming family instability. She stayed up late into the night, thinking about what she could do differently or what she could say to fix the situation. She even attempted to rearrange her own life with the desperate hope that her actions might make her parents' relationship stable once again. A psychologist who reviewed this film noted that many children, especially young girls, internalize the heavy belief that it is their personal job to hold the entire family together. The reality is that Stevie did not grow up to be a peacemaker or a therapist because she had a simple desire to follow those career paths. She learned these roles because chaos was the only constant she ever knew, and maintaining control felt like the only way to ensure her own survival. This deep and heavy texture of responsibility is familiar to a countless number of people who have lived through similar circumstances. For instance, a person on Reddit described their childhood by explaining that they were responsible for looking after their younger sibling from a very early age. They noted that this experience definitely shaped who they are today, leading to a life where they feel quite anxious about ensuring that everything is managed and looked after properly. That specific sentence says everything we need to know about how these patterns manifest in adulthood. It is not just a matter of liking organization, but rather a deep-seated anxiety about making sure every single detail is constantly managed. This particular kind of anxiety lives in the physical body and shows up in how someone approaches their work, their personal relationships, and their persistent inability to truly rest. Before moving forward, it is vital to understand that this development did not happen in isolation and was certainly not anyone's fault. Furthermore, this is not a problem that needs to be fixed by next Sunday through sheer force of will or self-criticism. The thoughts that eventually bring people to explore these patterns have usually been spinning in their minds for many years. These internal voices often say that there is something fundamentally wrong with them, or that they are simply too anxious for no reason. They might feel that they can never relax, that they take on too much responsibility, or that they have to earn their place in every relationship. Many people also struggle with the feeling that they cannot trust others in the same way that everyone else seems to do so easily. These are not just passing thoughts, but are the echoes of long-standing adaptations to a world that felt unsafe or unpredictable. Most people do not stop to ask these deep questions at 25, when they are still busy climbing the professional ladder and building a career. During those years, they are often too focused on proving something to the world or to the people around them to notice these underlying patterns. These realizations usually arrive much later, perhaps at age 45 or even 52, when external achievements finally stop filling the internal hole. This happens when someone has succeeded by every conventional measure of the word, and yet they find themselves feeling completely and utterly exhausted. It is at this point that they realize they have not actually experienced true rest in several decades. That is usually the exact moment when the heavy question arrives regarding why they are this way and where these patterns originated. The answer to this question is never that you are broken, but rather that you intelligently adapted to the environment around you. When a childhood environment was unpredictable due to family instability, financial uncertainty, or a rapidly moving world, the nervous system learned a specific lesson. It learned that a state of calm was not safe, and that relaxation was a luxury that could simply not be afforded. In such a world, someone had to stay alert, stay useful, and stay in total control at all times. These behaviors were never conscious choices made by a child, but were instead vital survival strategies developed in response to pressure. This is precisely what is meant by the phrase generational wounds, though we are not necessarily talking about trauma in a clinical or extreme sense. It is not an assertion that childhood was completely broken, or that every single event that occurred was damaging to the soul. Rather, it is an explanation of why someone is the way they are today, and how they arrived at this point in their life. Most importantly, these patterns are not your fault, and they certainly do not represent a life sentence that you must endure forever. It is important to clarify that this book is not about placing blame on parents who were likely doing their best with the resources they had. Many of them were simply managing their own inherited wounds and doing what they thought was necessary to survive their own lives. This exploration is also not about self-pity or wallowing in the difficulties of the past, as plenty of people had hard childhoods and turned out differently. Instead, this entire journey is about gaining the kind of deep understanding that was previously missing from your life. Understanding where these patterns came from gives you something that didn't exist before, which is the power to make a genuine choice. When someone finally understands why they are anxious or why they keep trying to control things that are not theirs to manage, they gain a new perspective. They get to make a different decision, not because they feel they should, but because the internal mechanism is finally understood and brought into the light. This process is not about trying to fix something that is broken or flawed within your personality. It is about recognizing something that was originally built to keep you safe, and then deciding whether you still need that protection in your current life. Context is the tool that allows this recognition to happen without the heavy burden of judgment or shame. By the time you reach the end of this book, 3 distinct things will become very clear to you. First, you will understand the historical moment you grew up in and how that moment shaped your very nervous system. Second, you will see the psychological patterns that developed as a response and likely recognize yourself in most of them. This is not a sign of damage, but is a sign of healthy adaptation to an environment, just as all humans do. Third, you will realize that recognizing these patterns does not mean you are stuck with them for the rest of your existence. There is a massive and life-changing difference between the statement, "I am anxious," and the statement, "I learned to be anxious because instability was everywhere." The first statement feels like a personal failing or a permanent defect of character that can never be truly healed. The second statement is simply context, which provides a logical explanation for your current internal state and opens the door to change. Because context changes everything about how we see ourselves, it is the foundation upon which all real transformation must be built. Chapter 2. What is a generational wound? There's a moment that happens, usually around 45 or 50. Someone's talking to a therapist, or they read something online, and suddenly it clicks. There's a word for this thing they've been feeling their whole life. There's a name for it. And the first thought is usually this: does that mean I'm broken? No, but it takes some understanding to know why. The word is generational wound, and right away, that word can scare people. It sounds like a diagnosis. Something wrong. Something that needs to be fixed. It's not that. Let's be clear about what it's not first. A generational wound is not trauma. There's a difference, and it matters. Trauma is something specific. A car accident, abuse, a sudden loss. Something that happens and the nervous system goes into overdrive trying to survive it. That's clinical. That's diagnosable. A generational wound is much quieter than that. It's not one terrible event. It's not, "my parents destroyed me," or "my childhood was ruined." It's something more like the water a fish swims in. The fish doesn't see the water. It just lives in it. And by the time the fish realizes what it's swimming in, it's been shaped by that water for decades. So what is it actually? It's a collection of learned responses, patterns, ways of being that made sense at the time in the world that someone grew up in. But then they stayed. They got so automatic, so normal, that by the time someone is 50 years old, they don't even realize they're doing them. Here's a concrete example. A child grows up with a parent who leaves without warning. Not all the time, just sometimes, unpredictably. That child learns something, not consciously, but deep down they learn. People leave. Relationships are not safe. If I let someone get close, they'll disappear. That's a survival response. It worked. It protected the kid from getting hurt too badly when the parent left. But now that kid is 45 years old. They're in a committed relationship. The partner is reliable, trustworthy, shows up every single day. And yet, deep down, there's a voice that says, they're going to leave. It's just a matter of time. Don't let yourself need them too much. That response kept the child safe. It's keeping the adult trapped. That's a generational wound. It's not broken. It's contextual. The nervous system learned something true in one context, and then it never updated the information. Think about another scenario. A kid grows up during a recession. Their parents are stressed about money. The conversations at dinner are about layoffs, about whether they can afford the house. The kid picks up on it, not from anything explicitly said, just from the anxiety in the room. And the kid learns. I need to be useful. I need to make myself indispensable. If I'm valuable enough, maybe we won't lose everything. 20 years later, that kid is a successful adult. They have money in the bank. Their job is secure. And they still can't stop working. They still feel guilty when they rest. They still have this driving need to prove their worth through productivity. Because that kid learned, safety equals productivity. And the body doesn't forget. Again, that's not broken. That's adaptation. The nervous system was doing exactly what it should do in an unsafe world. The problem is when the world changes and the nervous system doesn't get the memo. Research confirms this. Kelly and Emery, in 2003, studied children of divorce. They found that 25% of these children showed significant problems as adults. But here's the thing. They weren't mentally ill. They weren't broken. They had developed very specific responses to instability. They were hyper-responsible. They were hyper-vigilant. They didn't trust easily. These were smart adaptations to unstable families. But then those same people became adults, and the instability was often gone. They had stable jobs, stable relationships, stable lives, and their nervous systems were still running the old program. D'Onofrio's research in 2019 found similar patterns. Children of divorce had higher rates of academic struggles, behavioral problems, and depression. Again, not diagnoses. These were responses to a world that had told them, "You can't relax. Something might fall apart. You have to be ready." The question is, when does that response stop serving you? When someone is 50 years old and still can't take a vacation without feeling guilty? When they're in a healthy relationship but still waiting for abandonment? When they achieve their goals and still don't feel safe? That's when the old protection becomes a prison. Here's what matters about understanding this. If someone thinks they're broken, they try to fix themselves. They judge themselves. They think, "Why am I like this? What's wrong with me?" They add shame on top of the pattern. But if someone understands that their pattern was learned, that their nervous system was responding intelligently to a difficult environment, something shifts. It's not about excusing the pattern. It's about understanding where it came from. Understanding changes how someone relates to themselves. Bessel van der Kolk is a researcher who studies trauma. One of her most important findings is this: the body keeps the score. The nervous system remembers things even when the mind has moved on. Someone can know, rationally, that they're safe now. They can know they're loved. They can know the world is stable, and still feel, in their bones, like they need to be ready for disaster. This is not a choice. This is not something someone can think their way out of. The body has learned something, and it doesn't update just because someone had a logical thought. But it can update through understanding, through seeing where the pattern came from, through recognizing it as protection instead of pathology. A generational wound is really this. It's what happens when history becomes biology. When the world someone grew up in gets written into their nervous system. When survival strategies from childhood become the operating system for adulthood. And here's the thing that no one talks about enough. These patterns weren't mistakes. They weren't failures. They were genius. A child growing up in an unstable family who learns to be hyper-responsible. That's a smart kid who figured out how to survive. A kid who learns not to trust easily. That's a kid protecting their heart. A kid who learns to be productive, to feel safe. That's a kid solving a problem. These kids were smart. Their nervous systems were working perfectly. It's just that they're still working that way now, in a completely different world. So when someone hears the term generational wound, the question isn't, am I broken? The question is, what did my nervous system learn in order to survive? And does it still need to protect me that way? That's the difference between shame and clarity. This book is about providing that clarity. It's about showing where these patterns came from, why they developed, what they cost, and what becomes possible when someone understands them not as personal failures, but as intelligent responses to a world that required them. Because once someone sees their anxiety as adaptation instead of pathology, something shifts. The shame falls away. The self-blame becomes unnecessary. And what's left is information. It's context. It's the beginning of choice. Chapter 3. The world they grew up in. Before diving into the patterns, before naming what someone feels at 55 years old, there's something that needs to be seen. The world that shaped these patterns. The actual historical moment. Because patterns don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere real. It's about understanding the specific pressures that were in the air. The specific instability that a child's nervous system was picking up on, consciously or not. Let's start with something that most people in this age group lived through, even if they don't think about it much. The epidemic of divorce. In the 1950s and 60s, divorce was rare, stigmatized, something that happened to other people. A child growing up then could assume, my parents' marriage is permanent. This is my family structure. This is stable. But in the 70s, something changed. The divorce rate started climbing, and it didn't stop. By the early 80s, roughly 1 out of every 2 marriages was ending in divorce. That's not a gradual shift. That's a fundamental change in what family meant. For a child, this was seismic because the world sent a new message. Relationships could end. People you loved could leave. The thing you thought was permanent might not be. A woman on Reddit, someone who lived through this, described it simply. I was constantly moving between 2 houses, non-stop moving throughout my childhood. I never felt like I had a home. That's what the shift felt like from the inside, not an event, an instability that became normal. The research backs this up. Kelly and Emery found that 25% of children from divorced families showed significant problems as adults. But it wasn't just about the divorce itself. It was about what the divorce taught them. Children in unstable families learned. People leave. Closeness is risky. Don't depend on anyone too much, because they might disappear. Another person on Reddit, talking about their childhood of divorce, put it this way. I was angry for years. I pushed people away and sabotaged relationships out of fear that they would just end. That's the nervous system learning a lesson. And then living that lesson out decades later, even in relationships that are completely stable. There's something else that happened during this period. When divorce became common, something changed in how children related to their own families. Some kids became the peacemakers, the ones trying to hold things together. They took on adult responsibility way too early. A person described it on Reddit. From an early age, I was responsible for looking after my sibling. This experience shaped who I am. I tend to be quite anxious about ensuring that everything is managed and looked after properly. That kid learned. If I'm responsible enough, if I'm useful enough, maybe I can prevent things from falling apart. By the time that kid was 50, they still couldn't rest. They still felt like they had to manage everything. Safety in their body was tied to control, and control was exhausting. This is the first layer, the first thing that shaped a generation. Instability, unpredictability, the message that the foundation could crack. At the same time families were becoming less stable, the economy was becoming less stable too. And a child picks up on this. Maybe not from explicit conversations, just from the anxiety in the room. The 70s had recessions. The early 80s had the savings and loan crisis. The early 90s had the first Gulf War and economic uncertainty. 2001 came with the dot-com crash and then 9/11. 2008 came with the Great Recession. A child growing up during this period was receiving a consistent message, even if no one was saying it out loud. The world is not safe. Security is temporary. Things can disappear. Schneider and colleagues studied this. They looked at children during the Great Recession. The economic stress didn't just affect the adults. It created behavioral problems in the kids: aggression, anxiety, depression. Not because the kids lost their houses necessarily, but because they absorbed the anxiety of their parents. They learned uncertainty is everywhere. I need to be ready. There's a concept in psychology called the family stress model. It works like this. Economic pressure hits the parents. The parents become stressed. The stressed parents change how they parent. Maybe they become more controlling, or more withdrawn, or more anxious. And the kids, living in that changed environment, develop new responses, new ways of being. It's not the recession itself that creates the wound. It's the way the recession teaches the nervous system to operate, to be vigilant, to not waste, to not trust that things will work out. Someone on Reddit described growing up during this time. The promise of technology was that it would lead to less effort with the same results. Yet it seems to have turned into more effort and increased productivity. This person absorbed a message. The world demands more and more. You always have to do better. You never actually arrive. A parent living through the recessions of the 70s and 80s and 90s might not have said to their kid, "Don't trust stability, because it can disappear." But the kid learned it anyway. From the tone of voice, from the stress, from watching a parent worry about whether they could keep the house. And by the time that kid was 50 years old, even if they had money, even if they were successful, there was still a baseline anxiety, a sense that it could all go away, that safety was temporary, that they always needed to be productive, always needed to prove their worth, always needed to have a backup plan. The economy taught them this. The nervous system learned it. And it stayed. There's one more thing that shaped this generation in a way that's almost invisible now, because it's so normal. The technology shift. Someone in this age group has a strange experience. They grew up without the internet. Childhood was analog. Summers were long. There was no constant stream of information. No one knew what everyone else was doing all the time. No fear of missing out. Because missing out wasn't even possible. You just didn't know. And then, somewhere in their 20s or 30s, the world changed. The internet happened. Social media happened. And suddenly, there was a constant stream of information. Everyone could see what everyone else was doing. The world accelerated. For a kid who grew up without this, it created a strange feeling. The world moved faster. Opportunities seemed to multiply. But there was also a sense of falling behind, of not being able to keep up, of missing out on something, even if they didn't know what. Research on FOMO, fear of missing out, shows something interesting. It's not just a modern anxiety. It has deep roots in family dynamics. The psychologist Fadli found that social media and FOMO significantly impact emotional well-being in the digital age. Blumen and colleagues found that family structure and parenting style affect how much someone experiences FOMO. But here's the thing. For someone who grew up before all this and suddenly found themselves in it, there was an additional layer. A sense of permanent acceleration, of the world changing so fast that standing still meant falling behind. Someone described this on Reddit. I always feel like I'm not keeping up. The world changed, and I didn't change fast enough. That's not laziness. That's a nervous system that learned the world is stable and predictable, and then discovered it wasn't. So a child, growing up in this moment in history, was receiving multiple messages. From family, relationships can end, people can disappear, you might have to hold things together. From the economy, security is temporary. You need to prove your worth. You can't relax. From the world, everything is accelerating. You might not be keeping up. You need to be ready. These weren't explicit messages. They were absorbed from the environment. They became part of how the nervous system understood the world. The research shows the effects. D'Onofrio found that children of divorce showed higher rates of academic struggles, behavioral problems, and depression. But again, these weren't diagnoses. These were responses. The nervous system saying, "This is the world I'm in, and this is how I need to be to survive it." A child in this environment didn't become broken. The nervous system became calibrated to instability. It became excellent at reading danger. It learned to be responsible, to be productive, to not trust too much, to always be ready for things to fall apart. These are not weaknesses. These are strengths in an unstable world. The problem is that the world changed. The instability passed. The economy eventually stabilized for many people. The family, even if it was broken, was no longer actively breaking. The technology, even if it was accelerating, became normal. But the nervous system didn't update. It was still calibrated for a world that was no longer there. And that's when the adaptation becomes a cage. When the protection becomes the prison. Chapter 4. The patterns that formed now. It's time to name the specific ways these patterns show up. The automatic responses that have been running so long, they feel like personality. Before diving into each one, there's something important. These patterns are not flaws. They're evidence of intelligence. A child who learned to manage chaos learned something valuable. A child who learned to be useful learned to contribute. These weren't failures of development. These were successes. The problem is when they outlive their usefulness. Hyper-responsibility is probably the most obvious one. It's the feeling that everything is somehow the person's job. When something goes wrong, there's an immediate internal response. What could I have done differently? How is this my responsibility? What do I need to fix? This often starts in childhood with something concrete. A parent who's overwhelmed, a sibling who needs care, a family that's falling apart, and a kid who decides, consciously or unconsciously, that if they can just be good enough, be helpful enough, be responsible enough, maybe they can hold it together. There was a young woman named Stevie in a Netflix film called In Your Dreams. Her parents' marriage was dissolving, and Stevie took it upon herself to fix it. She didn't have a choice in her own mind. It felt like her job. The psychologist who reviewed the film noted that this is exactly what many children do when families become unstable. They internalize the belief that they are responsible for holding things together. By the time Stevie is older, that pattern would still be running. She might not be trying to save her parents' marriage anymore, but she'd still feel responsible for everything. For making sure everyone around her is okay. For managing situations that aren't actually hers to manage. For being the person who keeps things stable. Someone on Reddit described this. From an early age, I was responsible for looking after my sibling. This experience shaped who I am. I tend to be quite anxious about ensuring that everything is managed and looked after properly. Notice that word. Anxious. Not proud of being responsible. Anxious. Because responsibility without choice, responsibility that started too young, becomes anxiety. By the time someone is 50 years old, they're still doing this. They're the person in the office who takes on too much. The person in the family who everyone relies on. The person who feels guilty when they rest because somewhere, someone might need something. And they're the backup plan. Always. The long-term effect is something specific. These people have learned not to ask for help. They've learned that they're the helper, not the helped. They're the strong one. And there's a deep, quiet exhaustion that comes with that. Because being strong all the time is exhausting. Anxious planning is related but different. It's the inability to relax without a plan, the need to anticipate everything, to know what's coming. Because if something is unexpected, something could go wrong. This develops when someone grows up in an environment where unpredictability is the norm, where something could shift at any moment. The child's nervous system learns, if I can anticipate what's coming, I can prepare. I can control it. I can survive it. In the film Take Shelter, the main character, Curtis, is fixated on an apocalyptic vision. He's building a shelter. He's preparing for something terrible. On the surface, it looks like paranoia, but it's really hypervigilance. It's a nervous system that learned to anticipate danger and never stopped. Someone who grew up with a parent who left unpredictably, or whose family situation changed without warning, develops this. They become the person who always needs to know the plan, who spends mental energy running through worst-case scenarios. By adulthood, this shows up as chronic anxiety about the future. Just a baseline sense that something could go wrong and they need to be ready. It's exhausting because it never actually resolves. There's always another thing to prepare for. The inability to rest is perhaps the most painful one. A feeling that they should be doing something. That relaxation is a luxury they haven't earned. That if they're not productive, they're failing. This often comes from learning, early on, that safety and productivity are connected. A parent who's stressed about money. A kid who learns, if I'm useful, if I'm productive, if I'm contributing, maybe we'll be okay. Safety equals productivity. The film Black Swan shows this vividly. Nina, the main character, can never actually rest. She's always performing, always pushing, always trying to be perfect. The cost is visible. It's destroying her. But she can't stop because somewhere inside, she learned that being still means danger. By the time someone is 50 years old, they might have taken 5 vacations in the past decade. They feel guilty on everyone. They can't actually let themselves rest because the old lesson is still running. If I'm not productive, I'm not safe. The sense that love must be earned is deeper and quieter than the others. It's the belief that relationships are transactional. That if they're not useful, if they're not contributing something, the other person will leave. This starts when someone grows up with instability in their closest relationships. A child learns, love is not given. It's earned, and it can be taken away. Someone on Reddit described this. My parents divorced when I was young. I felt abandoned. I was angry for years. I pushed people away and sabotaged relationships out of fear that they would just end. That's the wound. The belief that if someone gets close, they'll eventually leave. So the safer thing is to keep them at a distance. By adulthood, this shows up as an inability to receive love without earning it. These people are often the givers in relationships. But when someone tries to love them just for being them, something in their nervous system doesn't believe it. It feels too risky. The film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind captures this. Joel is withdrawn, anxious, can barely connect with people because his nervous system learned that closeness is dangerous. There's another pattern underneath these, and it's about control. People who grew up in unstable environments often become people who need to control what they can. Because the big things, the family situation, the economy, the world, were out of their control. So they control what's possible. their schedule, their environment, their relationships. This can look like perfectionism, like someone who has a hard time with spontaneity or change. But underneath, it's just a nervous system that learned. When everything is chaos, the only safety is in the things I can control. All of these patterns share something. They're the nervous system's intelligent response to an unstable world. The child who became hyper-responsible was solving a real problem in their environment. The child who became anxious was protecting themselves from real unpredictability. These weren't failures. They were genius. The problem is that the world changed. But the nervous system didn't get the update. It's still running the old program. And that's when the pattern becomes a cage. Chapter 5. Why self-blame doesn't work. There's a moment when understanding clicks into place. The pattern makes sense now. It came from somewhere real. And then, inexplicably, comes self-blame. A person realizes their anxiety about money stems from watching their parents panic during recessions. They understand why they can't rest, because safety got tied to productivity in childhood. They see the whole mechanism, and immediately the thought arrives. So I need to fix this. I need to stop being anxious. I need to be different. The logic seems airtight. Understand the problem. Solve the problem. But something happens when someone uses understanding as a weapon against themselves. The approach backfires in a specific way that most people don't talk about. The nervous system doesn't respond to shame. It updates through safety, through repetition, through lived experience, not through self-judgment. A person can know, with perfect intellectual clarity, that their anxiety comes from instability they survived. They can trace the exact line from their parents' divorce to their current relationship fears. They can see it all. And their body will still clench when their partner is late coming home. Because the body doesn't care about the story. It only cares about whether it's safe. Blame adds a second layer to the original pattern. The child learned, the world is unsafe. I need to be vigilant. Now the adult adds, and also, I'm bad for still feeling vigilant. I should have fixed this by now. I should be over this. What happens next is that the original adaptation, the anxiety, the hyper-responsibility, gets reinforced by shame about having it. The pattern gets stronger, not weaker. The person isn't healing. They're just adding judgment on top of the wound. There's a reason this happens so consistently. The part of the brain that understands logically, the prefrontal cortex, is completely separate from the part that runs protective patterns. The amygdala, the part responsible for threat detection and survival responses, doesn't listen to rational arguments. It listens to signals of danger or safety. When someone is berating themselves for being anxious, what they're actually signaling to their nervous system is, you should be afraid. You're not good enough. There's something wrong. That's the opposite of safety. The distinction between responsibility and self-punishment is crucial here. Responsibility means, I understand this pattern. I'm going to make different choices going forward. I'm going to be patient with myself while my nervous system learns something new. Self-punishment means, I'm broken for having this pattern. I should already be fixed. I'm failing if I still struggle with this. Responsibility builds something. It creates the conditions for actual change because it contains compassion. Self-punishment just creates more suffering on top of the existing suffering. And the nervous system, sensing that it's under attack, digs in harder. The protective pattern becomes even more rigid. Most people don't realize they're doing this. It feels like they're being responsible, being hard on themselves in a productive way. They think, if I'm tough enough on myself, I'll change. But that's not how human beings work. That's not how nervous systems work. Research on shame actually shows the opposite. Shame makes people less likely to change, not more. When someone feels ashamed of a pattern, they're more likely to hide it, defend it, or act it out in destructive ways. They're less likely to look at it clearly and make different choices. The person who says, "I'm so anxious, there's something wrong with me, I should be past this," is actually cementing the pattern deeper. They're adding a layer of self-rejection on top of the original wound. And now, the pattern isn't just about protecting against an old threat. It's also about protecting against the self-judgment. This is why understanding alone doesn't heal anything. Understanding is necessary, but it's not sufficient. A person needs understanding plus something else. They need to hold the pattern with curiosity instead of judgment. They need to recognize it as intelligence instead of failure. They need to relate to their own nervous system the way a compassionate teacher would relate to a confused student. With patience, with interest, with the knowledge that the student is doing their best with the information they have. When someone shifts from "I'm broken" to "my nervous system learned something that made sense at the time," the entire relationship to the pattern changes. It's no longer personal failure. It's just information. It's context. And context is the beginning of choice. The irony is that the only way to actually move beyond a pattern is to stop treating it like an enemy. The only way to change is to stop demanding that you be different right now. The only way forward is to understand what the pattern protected you from. Acknowledge that it worked. Recognize that you've survived. And then, gently, without force, start to practice something different. That's not self-blame. That's clarity. And clarity is what creates actual change. Chapter 6. From I am to I became. There is a profound shift that occurs when context finally replaces blame. And while this transformation is rarely dramatic or loud, it fundamentally changes everything about a person's life. Many people spend decades believing that anxiety is an inherent part of their nature, rather than simply a feeling or a struggle they happen to face in the moment. This belief becomes deeply baked into their identity until statements like being an anxious person or a hyper-responsible individual feel like objective facts about their internal nature. These labels are often accepted as unchangeable traits, creating a mental prison where the individual feels they are simply defined by their struggles. Eventually, the framing of these thoughts begins to change as the person realizes they did not simply exist as anxious, but rather learned to be that way over time. Instead of feeling fundamentally broken or flawed, they start to recognize that they were actually adapting to the specific circumstances of their environment with intelligence. The linguistic shift from saying I am to I became opens up a new world of possibility for growth and eventual healing. This transition is far more than mere semantics, because the difference between fixed identity and personal history is both real and deeply significant for the soul. When someone believes they are inherently anxious or broken, that perception becomes a fixed trait that feels almost impossible to alter through effort. Change feels like a threat in these cases, because becoming someone else might feel like the complete annihilation of their existing sense of self. However, when a person understands that they became something through patterns and learned responses, the prospect of change finally becomes a reachable goal. Becoming is fundamentally different from being, because any process of becoming can eventually change its direction and purpose as life continues. Consider the difference between believing you are someone who takes on too much responsibility and recognizing that you became that person because your family required it for survival. The first perspective treats responsibility as an unchangeable character trait, while the second perspective views it as a historical adaptation to external pressure. If responsibility is viewed as an essential part of the soul, a person has no choice but to judge themselves harshly when they feel exhausted by the weight of the world. By contrast, seeing responsibility as a strategy allows someone to reconsider its utility and eventually release it when it is no longer necessary for their safety. The practical impact of this shift is significant because boundaries rarely stick when a person still believes the world will fall apart without their constant effort and vigilance. They might try to force change through sheer willpower or by reading books about delegation. But the underlying guilt always finds a way to creep back into their mind. Real change only begins when someone understands they became hyper-responsible because abandonment was a genuine threat during their most formative years. This realization allows them to see their behavior as a protective mechanism that made perfect sense within its original, often difficult, context. We see this dynamic clearly in the film In Your Dreams through the character of Stevie, who remains fixated on controlling every aspect of her parents' divorce. She believes her identity is defined by being the fixer who must hold everything together to ensure the stability of her entire family unit. As the story progresses, there is a vital moment where she stops believing that the stability of her parents depends entirely on her own constant actions. She eventually recognizes that she took on a specific role because the situation demanded it. But that role does not define the core of who she truly is as a person. The same logic applies to trust for those who grew up around unreliable people and eventually came to believe they were naturally incapable of trusting others. They might study the mechanics of building trust or attend therapy for years while still feeling that opening up to someone else is a fundamentally dangerous act. Everything changes when they realize they became someone who doesn't trust because they were punished for doing so during their vulnerable childhood years. Understanding that their distrust was actually an intelligent and protective response allows them to begin practicing trust in small, safe ways within the present. This shift creates the necessary space for genuine self-compassion, which is not about being soft, but about recognizing a child's intelligent survival strategies in the face of instability. A person on Reddit described how realizing their financial anxiety was a learned response to losing their home at age 12 changed their entire relationship with money. Instead of hating themselves for a perceived personal flaw, they started to understand the anxiety as a logical reaction to the loss of temporary security. Understanding the origin of the fear made it much easier to manage because they were no longer fighting against what they perceived as their own nature. When a person stops judging themselves for struggling and stops demanding that they should be past their issues already, they suddenly find they have much more energy for living. This happens because they are no longer wasting half of their mental cycles on self-judgment or remaining trapped in a toxic loop of shame. Shame tends to thrive in secrecy and silence, growing whenever a person treats a hidden part of themselves as a hated and dangerous enemy. It begins to shrink the moment those hidden parts are brought into the light and met with understanding instead of immediate rejection or judgment. Patterns like anxiety or hyper-responsibility may still exist within the nervous system, but they are no longer viewed as evidence of being fundamentally broken. These traits are actually evidence of survival. And recognizing this fact changes the entire story that a person tells themselves about their own life. This shift makes choice possible, allowing someone to notice their patterns with curiosity and ask if those old protections are still serving them in their current relationships. Real transformation begins only when the internal war ends and a person moves from a life of resistance to one of internal alignment and clarity. The journey from believing, "I am broken," to understanding, "I became adapted," is the difference between constant internal struggle and a life lived with true purpose. Someone in their 50s once described this journey by explaining how they spent 30 years believing they were lazy because of the guilt that they felt during rest. They eventually understood that growing up in a household where productivity was equated with love had conditioned their body to perceive stillness as a form of danger. This newfound understanding did not make the guilt disappear immediately, but it did make the feeling bearable and transformed their self-hatred into a sense of profound curiosity. This book exists to facilitate that specific shift and to help change the relationship you have with the patterns that have defined your life for so long. The goal is to move from a place of blame to one of understanding, transforming the thought, "something is wrong with me," into "something happened to me." Once this shift is made, the entire landscape changes because the shame dissolves and the internal resistance finally begins to soften. What emerges from this process is not just healing in the traditional sense, but a recognition of the pattern as the mark of a survivor who is now ready for a different choice. Chapter 7. How these patterns show up now. The patterns that originally formed during childhood do not simply disappear once an individual transitions into the complexities of adult life. These deeply ingrained habits persist invisibly, shaping how a person moves through their relationships, their professional career, and those quiet moments spent alone with their thoughts. While understanding where these patterns came from is an important first step, seeing how they show up in present-day life is a different and more challenging task. These patterns are never abstract concepts, because they are lived and felt in moments of vulnerability during an ordinary Tuesday or in conversations that should be simple. In the realm of personal relationships, childhood patterns often create a specific and persistent kind of confusion for everyone involved. Someone whose childhood home was unstable might find themselves in a perfectly stable relationship today and still struggle to believe it is real. A quiet voice underneath the surface constantly suggests that this peace will not last and that people will eventually leave. This leads to a defensive holding back, even when their partner has proven themselves to be completely reliable and trustworthy over many years of shared history. On the other hand, some individuals learned early on that love is something transactional that must be earned through constant service and effort. They often bend themselves into impossible shapes to fit whatever they believe the other person currently needs or desires from them. These people anticipate demands before they are even made, creating a dynamic where they feel they must constantly earn their right to be loved. When a partner tries to love them without asking for anything in return, their nervous system simply does not know what to do with that experience. A person on Reddit recently described this phenomenon by explaining how they frequently push people away and sabotage relationships out of fear. They finally realized they were doing to themselves exactly what they were most afraid someone else would eventually do to them in the future. This particular pattern shows up as a self-fulfilling prophecy where the fear of abandonment creates the very behaviors that prompt abandonment. Consequently, the original belief that people always leave becomes reinforced through their own defensive actions and emotional distancing from those who care. At work, these patterns show up differently, but carry similar emotional and physical costs for the dedicated professional. Someone whose childhood taught them that productivity equals safety becomes an adult who simply cannot stop working regardless of the circumstances. They are the ones who stay late, answer emails on vacation, and feel immense guilt for taking even a short lunch break during the day. The job becomes a theater where they must prove their value and make themselves indispensable because they believe being valuable is the only way to stay safe. This dynamic creates a particular kind of burnout that is far more profound than the normal exhaustion of a demanding career. It is the exhaustion of a nervous system that is still operating under the belief that everything will fall apart if they stop moving. despite achieving great success and earning the respect of their peers. These individuals never feel a true sense of relief or inner peace. The underlying struggle is not actually about the requirements of the job, but about whether they are fundamentally enough as a human being. Someone once described their career experience by noting that while technology promised less effort, it actually led to increased pressure and constant productivity. This person eventually learned that professional advancement and stability are not always about working hard enough to satisfy an internal demand. Their body, however, did not believe this logical conclusion, and the old pattern of overworking continued to persist in their daily life. The nervous system remains calibrated to a level of effort that was once required for survival, but is now entirely unnecessary for their well-being. In the realm of rest and relaxation, the patterns become almost comical in how relentless and unforgiving they are to the individual. A person can go on vacation to a beautiful place and still feel a heavy sense of guilt for not being productive every hour. They often bring work along or check their emails obsessively because they feel restless without a formal task list to complete. The body has learned at a very deep level that safety only comes from doing, while rest always comes with a hidden and dangerous price. This experience is fundamentally different from simply being a busy person with a lot of professional or personal responsibilities. This is a situation where the nervous system interprets stillness as a form of danger that must be avoided at all costs. Such individuals feel guilty for any form of enjoyment and cannot access the simple pleasure of doing nothing without a critical internal voice. This voice insists that they should be doing something useful and that someone must always be managing the world to keep it from collapsing. The chronic fatigue that many people in this age group experience often has this persistent lack of relaxation at its very root. It is not necessarily a medical problem, but rather the result of a nervous system that never fully relaxes and is always scanning for danger. The body becomes tired, not from what someone does during the day, but from what they refuse to let themselves not do. This constant state of being on drains the internal battery in a way that sleep alone can never truly repair or restore. Regarding the realm of control, these patterns manifest as a deep and profound discomfort with any form of uncertainty in life. Someone might micromanage their children, their partner, or their team at work to keep everything as predictable as possible. This behavior does not stem from a place of cruelty, but from a desperate need to avoid the chaos where danger originally lived. To the person practicing this control, unpredictability feels like the exact place where things will fall apart, and they will lose everything they love. This need for control often damages relationships, because partners and children feel they are not truly trusted or respected by the individual. While a partner might feel controlled and a child might feel suffocated, the person practicing the control feels they are doing something necessary. From their perspective, it does not feel like a form of manipulation, but rather like the only possible way to keep everyone safe. It feels like a genuine expression of love and care, even though the impact on others is often the exact opposite of what was intended. The anxiety that accumulates from trying to control things that are inherently uncontrollable is both significant and physically draining over time. Someone can spend decades trying to make the world perfectly predictable without ever reaching a state of true or lasting success. Because the world is by its very nature unpredictable, a nervous system that demands perfect control will always remain in a state of high anxiety. This constant vigilance prevents the person from ever fully inhabiting the present moment with any degree of peace or spontaneous joy. In friendships and community, these survival patterns often show up as a form of emotional isolation or distance from others. Someone who learned early on not to trust might keep even their closest friends at a significant emotional distance to prevent being hurt. They might have many acquaintances and participate in many social activities, yet they still feel that they have very few true friends. Such people often become the ones who listen to everyone else's problems, but never share their own internal struggles with anyone in their circle. Alternatively, someone who learned they are responsible for others might find themselves exhausted by friendships that are entirely one-directional. They are always the primary support system and the person everyone calls when they are in a state of crisis or need. They never ask for anything in return because they do not believe they deserve support or because asking for help feels dangerous. This role is familiar and safe to them, but it is also incredibly lonely and leads to deep resentment as the years pass by. All of these diverse patterns have one important thing in common. They made perfect sense at the time they were originally formed. They protected someone and helped them survive a situation that required those specific and intelligent adaptations to their environment. However, the original situation is no longer there, and the threats to their safety have changed significantly over the decades. The world has become safer in many ways, yet the old patterns persist as if the danger were still present and waiting to strike. This is where the most significant frustration often lives for people who are trying to understand themselves and move forward. A person can understand intellectually that they are safe now and can point to plenty of evidence that their life is secure. They can see that their partner is loyal, their job is stable, and their family is not currently falling apart or in danger. And still, at the level of the nervous system, the old message persists that the world is threatening and vigilance is necessary. The disconnect between what a person knows logically and what their body believes is one of the most painful aspects of inherited patterns. It means that someone can be objectively successful and loved, yet still feel a deep sense of fear and inadequacy every single day. They might feel like they are not enough or that the ground could shift beneath their feet at any moment without warning. This internal conflict creates a constant state of tension that makes it impossible to fully enjoy the fruits of their own hard work. These patterns show up in dreams and in the physical tightness that appears in the chest when someone suggests it is time to relax. They manifest in the way the mind immediately jumps to the worst-case scenario whenever a minor problem arises in daily life. They also show up in the relationships that end because someone wanted too much control or simply could not trust enough to be vulnerable. These habits are woven into the very texture of existence for anyone who learned early on that the world is not safe. The cost of maintaining these outdated survival patterns is substantial and shows up as chronic stress or health problems that doctors cannot explain. It often manifests as a quiet desperation in someone who has achieved everything they wanted but still feels a sense of emptiness. This is why understanding the origin of these patterns matters so much for the process of personal transformation and long-term health. Understanding does not make the patterns disappear, but it does create the possibility of having a completely different relationship to them. The patterns themselves do not vanish overnight, but they can soften and become less automatic as a person gains more awareness. Someone who knows why they are anxious can begin to question whether the anxiety is still necessary for their current life. Knowing why rest feels so difficult allows a person to gently explore what happens when they finally give themselves permission to be still. This shift from automatic compulsion to conscious choice is exactly where true freedom and healing begin for every individual. Chapter 8. How not to pass it on. There is a particular and heavy kind of anxiety that often comes with understanding generational patterns, especially for those individuals who have children of their own. This realization frequently arrives with a great deal of force as parents worry they might have already passed these destructive patterns down to the next generation. Such thoughts can easily trigger a cascade of intense guilt and harsh self-judgment as people begin to review every past conversation and every moment of frustration they shared with their children. It essentially becomes another version of the internal war where parents find new and painful reasons to blame themselves for their perceived failures. While the fear that someone will pass their patterns to the next generation comes from a very real and understandable place, it is important to look at what the research actually says. Children do indeed absorb the anxiety of their parents through both genetics and the simple observation of how their caregivers respond to the world around them. For instance, kids who grow up with a hypervigilant parent often become hypervigilant themselves because their nervous systems are constantly learning from their immediate environment. If a parent struggles to rest or relax, their children will likely experience the same challenges as they grow into adulthood and form their own habits. However, what most people do not realize is that simple awareness can fundamentally change the way these patterns are transmitted between generations. The psychologist Mary Hesselmans and several of her colleagues have discovered that parents who are aware of their own patterns are much less likely to pass them on unconsciously. This is not because they suddenly become perfect parents who never make mistakes, but because awareness provides them with a conscious choice in the moment of stress. This capacity for choice is exactly where the cycle of generational patterns can finally be broken for good within a family line. Breaking the cycle is not about becoming a perfect parent who never gets angry or never experiences a single moment of anxiety in front of their children. That level of perfection is entirely impossible to achieve and is not actually what a growing child needs to thrive in the real world. What children actually need is a parent who is aware enough to know when they are feeling activated or stressed by their own internal triggers. This allows the parent to model the healthy process of noticing a pattern rather than just acting it out without any thought or reflection. The transmission of these patterns typically happens through two main channels, one of which involves the explicit messages we give our children about how the world works. These messages might include the idea that you must always be responsible, or that trust is something that should be avoided at all costs. Children absorb these rules and begin to build their own internal nervous systems around the beliefs that their parents project onto them. They learn that relaxation is perhaps a selfish act, or that their primary job in life is to ensure everyone else is feeling okay at all times. The second channel of transmission is much more implicit and involves the anxiety and stress that is held within a parent's physical body. Children pick up on the emotional weather of their household through the stress in a parent's voice or the way they move through the world with constant vigilance. Long before a child can think about these issues logically, they are already absorbing the atmospheric stress of their primary caregivers. The fundamental question then becomes how awareness can step in to change this automatic and often invisible process of emotional inheritance. Awareness first allows a person to question the messages they are automatically transmitting to their children during the stresses of daily life. Someone who grew up hearing that emotions are a sign of weakness might catch themselves before they say that exact same thing to their own child. They might pause and choose to say something different, perhaps even explaining that they are trying to do things differently than how they were raised. This is not a sign of a perfectly healed parent, but rather a parent who is conscious enough to try for a better outcome for their family. Furthermore, awareness creates a vital space between a specific trigger and the automatic response that usually follows it in a chaotic moment. A parent whose own childhood was unpredictable might feel a flash of panic when their child is being particularly messy or unstructured. In that moment, the old lesson that chaos is dangerous might fire off. But awareness allows them to realize that this is just their own anxiety speaking. Instead of suppressing the feeling, they can have a conscious relationship with it and choose a response that is appropriate for the current situation. The way a parent speaks about their own patterns around their children also plays a significant role in whether shame is passed down as well. Someone who constantly criticizes themselves for being anxious is inadvertently transmitting a sense of shame to their children through their own self-hatred. However, a parent who explains that their anxiety comes from their own past is showing their child that patterns can be seen and worked with calmly. This is incredibly valuable modeling because it teaches the child that being human involves having patterns that can be understood and managed without judgment. Research is very clear that children whose parents are able to reflect on their own behavior are far more likely to develop secure attachments. This is not because these parents are perfect in every way, but because they are conscious of why they respond to the world in certain ways. Consciousness is what allows for the possibility of choice, which is the most powerful tool any parent has for changing the trajectory of their family. Practically speaking, this involves noticing when an old pattern is being activated by a child's behavior and choosing a different path than the one they inherited. This process does not require making the perfect choice every single time, but simply making conscious choices most of the time during daily interactions. It might involve explicitly telling a child that a previous response came from a place of personal anxiety rather than who the parent actually wants to be. It also means using different language when talking about big feelings, such as telling a child that it is perfectly okay to have strong emotions. Instead of labeling a child as irresponsible, a conscious parent might offer help with organization so they can figure out a solution together. A crucial part of this work involves not making a child responsible for the parent's own emotional state during times of high stress or frustration. A parent who claims that a child is making them angry is placing a heavy and unfair burden on that child's shoulders. By contrast, a parent who admits they are feeling frustrated and needs a short break is modeling true emotional awareness and self-responsibility. Managing one's own anxiety through exercise, therapy, or simple honesty is one of the most effective ways to protect a child's developing nervous system. Being honest about what a parent cannot yet do is another powerful way to break the cycle of hyperproductivity or constant vigilance. A parent who struggles to rest might admit to their child that relaxation is difficult for them, while still emphasizing that rest is healthy and necessary. This is far better than silently modeling a life of constant work while expecting the child to somehow avoid falling into the same trap. It shows the child that the parent is a work in progress and that growth is a lifelong journey that everyone must undertake together. One final and essential point is to ensure that the child is never made responsible for the parent's own healing or emotional recovery. A parent should never expect their child to help them feel better or to fully understand all the difficulties they went through in the past. Taking responsibility for one's own growth in therapy or through reflection is the parent's job alone, though they can share age-appropriate lessons they learn along the way. You do not have to be completely healed to be a wonderful parent, but you do have to be willing to see and own your patterns. The truth is that being a good parent simply requires awareness and a willingness to apologize when your old patterns get the best of you. This is more than enough to change the direction for the next generation and ensure that your children do not inherit the same heavy burdens. While the wounds of the past may not end with you, the unconscious transmission of them certainly can be stopped through the power of consciousness. This is the practical and lasting gift that comes from understanding where your patterns originated and deciding to do things differently for those you love. Chapter 9. Conclusion. By this point in our journey, the entire framework has been carefully laid out before you, describing the historical moment and naming the specific patterns that define your experience. We have illustrated how these habits show up in your present-day life and offered the real possibility of breaking the cycle for future generations. However, a conclusion should be far more than a simple summary of previous points. It serves as a vital landing place where you can step back and see the transformation that has occurred through these chapters. Someone who began this book might have started with a vague and persistent sense that something was fundamentally off within their internal world. By now, that heavy feeling of being more anxious or less trusting than others has been given a proper context and is no longer viewed as a personal failing. What once felt like evidence of weakness or core dysfunction is now recognized as a brilliant adaptation and a survival strategy that was born from pure intelligence. Your nervous system learned essential lessons during childhood about the instability of the world and the temporary nature of personal security. It learned that productivity was a necessity and that maintaining total control was the only available path to safety in an unpredictable environment. While these lessons made perfect sense in the world where they were originally learned, the reality of your current environment has likely changed significantly over the years. The core insight of this work is that the patterns themselves are not the problem, but rather the fact that they have outlived the specific context that first necessitated their creation. The moment someone understands this truth, the burden of shame begins to drop away because the patterns are no longer seen as evidence of being broken. Instead, these behaviors are viewed as proof of having survived something difficult and as a testament to your own resilience as a human being. There is a profound and life-altering difference between believing you are fundamentally anxious and understanding that your body is simply trying to protect you in the way it learned long ago. The first perspective is rooted in a deep sense of shame, while the second is pure information that serves as the very beginning of your long-awaited freedom. Moving from shame to information changes your internal relationship with yourself, allowing you to stop the exhausting war that has consumed so much of your energy. While these patterns do not magically disappear overnight, your relationship to them can transform from an automatic compulsion into a conscious and empowered choice. You might notice the urge to take on unnecessary responsibility and then pause to ask if this burden is actually yours to carry in your current life. That brief moment of hesitation is where true choice enters your existence, allowing you to experiment with new ways of being and resting without the weight of old fears. This book has also tried to remain clear that this journey is not about blaming parents who are usually just trying to survive their own inherited wounds and pressures. Understanding generational patterns is about removing shame from the equation and replacing it with the clarity needed to navigate a changing world with grace. We must also recognize that these adaptations are actually evidence of extraordinary resilience, rather than signs of personal weakness or character flaws. A child who became hyper-responsible or hyper-vigilant was intelligently protecting their heart in an environment that felt unsafe or unpredictable at the time. When you recognize yourself as a survivor rather than a broken individual, an entirely different set of futures becomes possible for you and your family. Some will use this understanding as a foundation for therapy, while others will let their nervous systems slowly learn through the simple power of lived experience. The point of this work is that understanding creates options where there was only automatic and painful reaction before. You are not a broken person, but a contextual one, who developed in a particular historical moment under a particular set of pressures. Your nervous system adapted to those pressures in intelligent ways that likely saved you during the most difficult times of your life. The vital question now is whether these old adaptations still serve your current life, and what might be possible if you finally made a different choice today. This exploration can only happen from a place of deep self-compassion, where you are no longer at war with your own history or nature. Generational wounds begin to heal through the slow and steady practice of awareness rather than through a sudden and total transformation of the self. By breaking the unconscious transmission of these patterns, you are deciding what shape you want your life to take in this new and final chapter of your journey. The wound certainly does not have to end with you, but the unconscious transmission of it can finally stop through the power of your own consciousness and understanding. As you move forward from this moment, may you find the quiet strength to trust the peace you have built for yourself and your family over many difficult years. You have earned the right to step out of the shadows of past survival and into the warmth of a life lived with genuine intention and internal alignment. Let your breath be slow and your heart be light as you finally set down the heavy burdens that were never truly yours to carry through this world. The path ahead does not require your constant vigilance or perfection, but only your presence and the gentle courage to choose yourself every single day.